Greetings, hello, and welcome to Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainable development around the world and across Africa. I'm George Mutalemwa, moderating this session on behalf of the Africa Peace and Development Network, MAMA. Our theme today is Reclaiming Diplomacy, and the speaker is Clem McCartney. He is an independent research consultant from Northern Ireland. He is the founding member of Diplomats Without Borders in 2022 and has been also consultant for many people, including leaders in government and civil society. So it's really a pleasure having you, Clem. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time. And I thank also everybody on this call for joining Global Peace. And now I'd like to ask you to start your presentation. So please do join me in welcoming Clem McCartney.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm not sure if there's anyone I know, but thank you, everyone, and perhaps there are. I'm pleased, maybe privileged to be invited to join you. Thanks very much to you for having me here today. My only problem is I don't know whether I can live up to that, your expectations, because what I really want to do is just to share some reflections from my experience down through the years. How things look to me and explore with you whether there's some validity in those ideas and what we can learn from them or what we can apply and use in our work. I have limited involvement in Africa. I have some, but not a huge amount. But I've worked quite a lot with African leaders, so that's also quite a valuable experience. George just said something about my background, but maybe first of all, to position what I want to say, if I could just say a little bit more about what I have done during the years. My wife often tells me that I've never sat still in one place. I'm some kind of a butterfly, and she means that as an insult and a criticism. But it is true. So I started out studying law. And after studying law, I didn't want to be a lawyer. I knew that pretty well. One reason was that in the theory of law, I learned that law changes subtly and imperceptibly to fit the needs of the elite of the times. And I wasn't really and I enjoyed knowing that, thinking about that, but I wasn't very interested in practicing that and being the servant of that kind of system. So I decided after university, I went and was involved with working with people living in the streets, living in intentional communities, small communities of people who had been on the streets. I liked that. And so from there, I then went into community development, working with local communities, trying to get established, trying to ensure that they had the services they need. And from there to social development. So I was broadening out the scale from the intentional community to the wider community, to the society as a whole. So I worked in social development in the developing world. There they had conflict. And when I arrived, and I come from a country which has conflict, Northern Ireland, and I was very interested in it. It was my environment, but I hadn't engaged with it as an actual participant. The people in the communities that I was dealing with were involved, and I often enjoyed talking with them and exploring with them why they'd chosen the options they had and what other options they might have. But when I got to my new position, I was going to be teaching there. The director of the college met me at the airport, and while we were waiting for my baggage to come off, he says, "You'll be our expert in tribal fighting. I understand you've got tribal fighting problems back where you come from." So I said, yeah, but I really wasn't thinking that I was in a position to really do that. But the more I thought about it, and over the years while I was there, I was hauled out every bit now and again to give a lecture on conflict, and particularly on the conflict in Northern Ireland. And the more that I did that, the more I saw the patterns and the dynamics which recur, even if the issues are different. And so I decided from that experience to work in conflict resolution, conflict transformation, in my own country and in other places, mediation, um, conflict analysis. Depending, I was working first of all, I worked in the university, and then I worked as a freelance person. And so I was on call to various places where it might be useful to share my experience. From there, I got involved more in peace building than conflict resolution because I was invited to help an organization you may know of, Club de Madrid, which is an organization of former presidents and prime ministers. And they were aware that exclusion, social exclusion for parties in a society, social exclusion for some communities in a society were part of the problems that society faced and how they were having it difficult to overcome them and leading to conflict and tension. So we turned it around and we created a project which we called the Shared Societies Project, which was to look at what was needed in order to make a society where everybody would feel it belonged to them and willing to play a full part in sharing in it. And I could talk to you about that for a long time because I worked on that for a long time. But George asked me to keep moving. So I did that for about 12 or 13 years. And then more recently, as George said, I got involved with the establishment of Diplomats Without Borders, which is an organization of former ambassadors and former senior officials in international organizations, such as the UN and so on. And its purpose is really to give an opportunity to share the experience of those people and to give them an opportunity to continue to be useful after they finish their diplomatic career. And I was asked to lead the conflict element of that work. And so we set up a number of groups which are continuing to work on particular conflicts around the world. We have a group working on Myanmar, a group on Sudan, a group in Libya, Afghanistan. One of the problems is that our members all wanted to work on the hard ones. I had thought that it might have been quite useful for us to take some easy, low-hanging fruit to work on and demonstrate how we could be useful, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to go for the biggies. So it's challenging work. But one of the things that I think we were very aware of was the limited application of diplomacy and true mediation in a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these situations. And also the decline of the multilateral system and the rules-based order that I think we were aware of it individually, and now we were coming together. We were trying to work in particular places, and we realized that the challenges to the global system were really becoming more acute. At the same time, the war started, the special operation started in Ukraine, and the war started in Gaza. Gaza is one that our members have been keen to work on, but we haven't found an entry point yet, and it may not be that we'll find any useful role there. But we were very keen to be involved in these issues, and we were very aware that the global system wasn't able to manage them. It wasn't able to stop the conflicts, the violence starting, and they weren't able to bring the violence to an end. So we've also now got a stream of work which is what we call issues in multilateralism, and it's about how the the rules-based system has been undermined, and how it doesn't seem in national interest of the strongest parties to be willing to try and make a global system work. It seems much more preferable to them to try to use the power and force that they have to impose their will on other parties, which may be building up lots of problems for the future, and certainly makes it very difficult to solve any of the problems that I've referred to, and many other problems that you could also think of that I haven't mentioned. So we have been looking at that. We've been looking at the decline in respect, if you like, for the UN, perhaps partly justified, but partly because of the actions of countries to make it difficult for it to work. The African Union, to a lesser degree, faces some of the same problems. Other regional bodies also do. So the organizations we have, which should be able to help to moderate conflict, be a place where we could look at together at how to solve those problems, or actually become a platform for parties to um, make their pitch for winning. And so we've been involved in thinking about those, trying to organize different ways to look at them, trying to organize debates, conferences, and so on. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to what we've called reclaim diplomacy. We've been developing a little handbook where we will try to make the case for why diplomacy should be taken account of and should be applied. I know many of you work in mediation, so I think what I'm saying here about diplomacy, mediation is a tool of diplomacy, and the same problems and difficulties arise there as anywhere else. So that's the kind of introduction to how I've got to where I am at the minute and why diplomacy is a kind of a particular interest. As I said earlier, my wife has said that I'm a bit of a grasshopper and don't stay long in one place. But I think there's been recurring themes within what I've been doing. And one of them is that I was quite cynical. I was cynical about politicians and I was cynical about diplomacy. And yet I've ended up working with diplomats and working with politicians. And I'm very aware of von Clausewitz's quotation, as you know, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And the corollary of that would be that diplomacy is a continuation of war by other means. It presents them both as coercive activities in which you try to influence the other to do what you want. And that brings me to the main crux of what I want to talk about, and which I think is a theme that I've been interested in for a very long time. And that is about change, because we work for change. We try to achieve change. And so I'm interested in how people change and how communities change. And I'm interested, do you get change through force and coercion and pressure, or do you get change by cooperation? I know how you, probably everyone here will answer that question, but it's that dilemma that exercises my mind, because many other people see it, that force and pressure and coercion is the way to get things done. And when we are talking about change, talking about achieving a more fair, more equitable society, a more sustainable world, all of those things, I think the first question is, how do we get from the world in which people see change as something that they impose to suit themselves as an act of pressure, to a world in which we build change together? And that's ironic because, we had, when I was working with the Club de Madrid, it was the time in which the Sustainable Development Goals were being created. And the global system was able to bring people together to draft and develop and publish a fine set of targets and goals in Agenda 2030. Implementation of it is a bigger problem and a continuing problem, but it did show the capacity of people to work together using diplomacy. Immediately afterwards, we settled down to try to sort the problem of immigration. And the world community was able and willing to draft and publish and agree and publish the documents on immigration and also on refugee status. And that also has really not been applied. Even more so, it's being ignored in many parts of the world and not being implemented. So we have the capacity. We know how we can work together, but we're not very good at applying and implementing agreements that we make and reach. So, and that to me is about diplomacy. And when I might have been cynical about diplomacy at one stage, I also realized that we can't make progress without it. We need diplomacy. We need diplomacy to be working. And yet we hear people saying tonight, diplomacy doesn't work. Why is diplomacy not solving problems? Why is mediation not working? Why can mediation not solve problems? And if, for example, what is going on now in Sharm el-Sheikh, the negotiations over a peace deal, as it's called, in Gaza, if that fixes, if that is achieved, if that is implemented, will it solve the problem? Because it's not really a negotiated solution in which the different parties have been able to express what they need and what they want. They have kind of, I mean, the goalposts have shifted over 2 years of disaster, if you like. But if it does succeed, it will encourage, I think, other places to decide that that's what they need to do about the problems that they have. But it may not give a solution, and it certainly had huge costs in getting to this point. So we are in a situation where mediation, negotiation, diplomacy are being given a bad press, and power politics and using leverage and to get things done has become very much the order of the day. So one of the and the reality is that diplomacy has not been used. It's not been tried. It's not being allowed to be tried in many of these conflicts. It was never tried in the Ukraine conflict. There was a lot of bluster and threats if Russia entered Ukraine, which was a very good way of telling him that if he came into Ukraine, nothing would happen. But what happens next is that everybody says, "Oh, we didn't have enough weapons. If we'd had more weapons, then we would be more secure." But actually, the lesson from the Ukraine situation, in my view, is weapons in itself doesn't solve problems. I'm not saying I would probably be a pacifist by my own inclination, but I'm not ruling out there's times when people might need to use some kind of peacekeeping forces. But the idea that you need more strength in order to get security is a false argument in my view. But it becomes a dominant discourse in society, and it's very hard to counter and it's very hard to challenge. But if it's not challenged, then it becomes even more established that diplomacy doesn't work, that mediation doesn't work, and that there isn't other ways in which we can resolve our problems, which don't cause all the bloodshed and killing and so forth, and which, in more cases than most cases, provide much more secure, sustainable and durable solutions, which have their own inbuilt acceptance by the party and therefore provides more security for all of the parties. So we have to keep saying that, and we have to keep arguing it rather than get defensive. We have to say, you're wrong, it works, it has worked, and so on. At the minute in Diplomats Without Borders, we're in the process of producing a handbook. We've got a draft. We have just getting it approved by our board, which we hope will become our own little reference point of saying, this works, this is important. And I just want to share with you a few comments on what we're saying in that, because the problem we have is that we say reclaiming diplomacy, because people are saying we're using diplomacy. And I remind you of that classic moment now in the White House earlier this year when the president of Ukraine was visiting the president of the USA. And so they're all sitting around the table, and the vice president gives a lecture on all the wonderful things that the US is doing, about meeting with Putin, about uh, getting his support. He's a fine fellow, and so on and so forth. And then he finishes by saying, that's diplomacy. And Zelensky says, what kind of diplomacy? And then the whole thing blows up and they all shout at him, and it becomes a very raucous discussion because he had touched the nerve. They want to claim that diplomacy is what they do. And Zelensky was saying, no, that's not diplomacy. There is a kind of diplomacy that works, and you're using a kind of diplomacy which causes problems. And so the difficulty we have is that the word diplomacy is being used by other people. And I don't think we have a clear word for saying, I haven't thought what the word would be, from saying that on the one side there is what I would call principled diplomacy, the kind of diplomacy that works with the parties, that tries to resolve issues, that acknowledges that the other side has a point of view, and so on and so forth. As opposed to the kind of diplomacy which is about coercion, pressure politics, backroom deals, threats, bribes, sweeteners, as you might call them. And so we need to change the language. And I don't know how to find the right language to do that with. But I think we can identify and say, this is what diplomacy is, and it is also what mediation is. It involves respect for the other party. It involves recognition of the other party's aspirations. It involves commitment to applying international rules and norms in our dealings with other people, not redefining them and rewriting them, as has been done with the right to self-defense, which has become an excuse for aggression, or long, interminable arguments about whether a judgment of the International Court of Justice is valid or whether it's biased. There needs to be respect for the rules as they are, not now, even if we might want to change them. That's what national rules are about, and that's what international rules should be about as well. It involves a willingness to engage, to meet the people that you don't like, to meet the people that you think are doing wrong. I've always felt in the work that I do, it's always a case of saying, we're meeting you in spite of what you do, not because of what you do. Sorry. I need to switch off my electricity. So we need to be willing to engage and actually try to hammer out things together. We need, when we engage, to clearly articulate what our interests are, as well as what the other people's interests are, and to put those into balance together. We need to then work jointly to solve the problem. We need to be able to say, we have a problem. You have a problem, we have a problem, so we all have a problem. Now let us jointly work out how to solve that problem, rather than saying, we have a solution, you accept our solution, and then everything will be fine. And we need to work in mutual good faith. What we don't want, what we also need, is a certain way of working. And this is, I find a little bit confusing in my own mind, because I think we have to work with courtesy, with discretion, with patience, with restraint, and listen attentively to the other person. We don't want to be doing the kind of things that were happening in the White House that day with Zelensky. We don't want to be bullying, interrupting people, denigrating people, or mocking people. We need to say, that's not diplomacy. This is diplomacy. And I said I was a bit uncertain about some of these things, about the way in which diplomats should act and mediators should act. I know that down during the years, many political leaders and diplomats and others would say they were applying good rules, good order, working in a polite and dignified way, but they were actually not doing that underneath the surface. It's not in itself it's not in itself a marker of good faith. And so at the same time, I sometimes look back to 20 years ago when that was the norm and thought, well, at least we know what the standards are, even if people are breaking the standards. But now we don't know what the standards are because we're not saying we should resign when we do the wrong thing. We should be respectful of others. We just act, not we, but some people act in ways which are very undiplomatic. So that's where I come from, and that's where I would be interested to explore with you. Just what can we do to return to a system which seems to at least give a framework in which we can work, and then we can strengthen it, and then we can make it more applied generally by everybody. Because I think we know that the way that totalitarian systems work is the more you say a thing, the more it becomes true, because everybody forgets that there's any other way of looking at things, And so when people say, this is diplomatic, this is a good way to work, this is a respectful way to work, we need to say, no, it's not. This is wrong. This isn't what we want. We need to work in this other way, which is a way that really builds cohesion, cooperation, and a working political system. But if we shrug our shoulders and say, well, there's not much we can do about those things, then we're actually reinforcing that what they call diplomacy, what they call mediation, is the rule of the game. And I think that's very dangerous. I don't know if I've talked long enough for you, but I'd much prefer to discuss than to talk. So can we hand it back to the floor? George?
Yeah, thank you so much, Clem, for this brilliant presentation on reclaiming diplomacy. And you've discussed a number of very important issues, including social exclusion, but also the importance of the shared society. We talked about the issues in bilateralism, but it also helps us understand what diplomacy really is. And now I can see Janet's hand. I would like to welcome Janet to start with a question or comment. You're welcome, Janet.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Clem, for this. So beautifully you demonstrate the calm, thoughtful caringness that we need to engage in trying to work through conflicts, as I understand them, and as I understand the process. And the situation is appalling now. How the media repeats problems that are, the ways of behaving that are outrageous, almost validating them. When, if you remember Sarah Palin, who is vice presidential candidate, and then when McCain and Palin lost the election, and then everyone said, don't mention her name again. Don't spread anything she's saying. And that was Nebulia. I think thank you. So okay, so here's my question. I work in peace education. I work on justice as a peace as the implementation of justice, and justice as fairness and as the presence of justice. And so I work a lot on the norms, and I think that diplomacy is a sort of a dangerous thing to enter into. So your own case, and how you've managed to bring your dignified, caring, rules-based orientation even into working in diplomacy is very encouraging and impressive. And my question is that I see diplomats as having things to bargain with. as opposed to people like us who work on peace education, norms, conflict resolution, community building. And so I always feel, well, we don't have the same power, the same, we can't manipulate who gets what to sweeten deals, as you said. So could you clarify or explain something about those two strands that I see separate when the tire hits the road? Is that clear?
It's
Oh.
clear, but do you want me to answer that or comment on that, or do you want to pass on to the next question but first?
You may respond to that, Clem, and then we'll go to Simon Mary.
Well, aren't we lucky, Janet, that we don't have all this power and a capacity to... It's an awful lot easier to just kind of shortcut everything and impose our solution and get what we want. One of the problems with people with influence and power is that they haven't the patience to wait for this other process, which takes longer and is more durable to happen. You know, the expression that Maslow had, you know, if I have a hammer, everything seems like a nail. You know, if I've got guns, why not use them? If I've got economic power, why not apply it? Why not impose tariffs on other people, even if it backfires on myself eventually? So we are actually kind of lucky, I think, that we haven't got that option. And also we're quite lucky because the people we're working with know that we're not going to do that to them. They know that we haven't got that capacity and probably aren't trying to get it. We're willing to come empty-handed and say, walk beside you, and we will walk beside you and see if we can solve this problem together. But I think what we can show and offer is the idea of joint problem solving, that it's not a question of bargaining with each other, with saying, you give me that, I'll give you that, or whatever it might be. That is an element of it, of negotiation, but it's not the core of negotiation. For me, the core of negotiation, which we are trying to demonstrate in our work, is what is it you want? What is it we want? How are those incompatible? And how can we solve that problem of having incompatible aspirations or requirements or interests? And let's sit down and work on it together. And let's not bargain over what you will give and I will give, but let's get ourselves a clean sheet of paper and build on that. And I think if you look at many of the more durable conclusions that have been reached, they have actually not maybe done it as consciously as that or as clearly as that, but they have actually been doing that. They've allowed the parties to clarify what it is they want. They've reached a stage where they can say, well, here is the framework for the agreement, because it has to deal with those different elements. And now we have to explore those together. It's a slower process. The Colombian negotiations with FARC took quite a long time. The negotiations in Aceh took quite a long time. My own situation in Ireland also took quite a long time. And there was a long time when people were coming round from the idea that they could win, because that's the other thing. It's helping people to recognize we can't get as much by winning as we can by working together. Because if you think you can win without giving up any control, then you'll go for it. It makes sense logically, even if it doesn't make sense if we've got a longer vision and a wider vision. So I think that's the problem we have. Exactly what you said, Janet, is that we tend to lose sight of that, and we tend to lose confidence in what we know and what we believe already. But we then begin to say, and we argue with that. We don't quite know how to argue with the statement, mediation doesn't work, diplomacy doesn't work.
Yeah. That I want to respond, if I may, George, because that's wonderful. I think you pulled forward a point, which is when the public loses faith in the government, when the public loses faith in the UN, when the public loses faith in diplomacy. And that's something, for example, in the United States, that's been happening since obviously, to me anyway, not just radicals, but when the Iraq War, first Afghanistan and then the Iraq War and then torture and then, taking people to Guantanamo who weren't, prisoners of war, and these kinds of manipulations of language, that people started to really distrust government. And of course, a whole layer of people always feel left out of government. But I think that that on the normative level, how would you encourage people to, both from the governmental and the diplomatic end, encourage people to gain faith again in our institutions, as opposed to think, well, nothing's working? A common phrase is, everything's broken. The legal system is broken. The Supreme Court is broken. The UN is broken. I think that should go the way of Sarah Palin, and we shouldn't mention that anymore. And because it's up to us to engage in that. Anyway, so you helped me refocus the question even more. So I don't know if you want to answer that or you want to let it sit and have other people take a turn.
Well, I've written down a couple of notes here on what you said so I don't lose sight of them. But it might be more better to have a conversation than just you and I. So I'll come, if it doesn't get dealt with any other way, if George gives me permission at the end, I'll come back to them.
All right, you may respond as you wish. And let's now turn to Simon Mary. And so Simon Mary, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I am missing in action. I teach. I will leave very soon, though. That said, I was joking on a humorous note. Leave my Sarah Palin alone, Janet. No, okay, on a very serious note then. Clem, as we're talking, it dawned on me immediately that the crisis we face, some of these crises, are also produced by enduring narratives sometimes in the educational system, a weaponized educational system that validates positions of hate towards other groups. But yet, when we get into the domain of diplomacy, politicians or governments deploy diplomats to those places to fix these problems. The after effect of the enduring narratives, because these narratives are supposed to produce actions. But we don't deploy educators to these spaces, to these lands of crisis, so that a healthy, liberative education can be embraced, can be taught, can be impacted into these people's consciousness. I give you a simple example, the crisis in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's not just a crisis. And yes, I know it was resolved by the Dayton Accord, but having been there myself and then talked to people and also studied little bit of it, so it is the youths who decided to educate themselves, to have a counter-education against what their so-called leaders had implanted in their psyches. So but that's not always the case everywhere. So I was just wondering what your thought is on this.
Yeah, well, I think the idea that we're dealing with enduring narratives is a very important one. And I had said, it's how do people begin to change? But what I'm saying is the change that's needed is not just the change in the practicalities, it's a change in that underlying assumption about how things can get done and how things are done. So we're actually thinking, I think always in these kind of situations, how can you give up that old narrative that you have to be strong and you have to be in control and that you can't live with each other, those kind of things. And I agree with you about what you say about Bosnia. though I do know that people did. I'm not sure what you actually meant, Simon Derry, but there were people helping young people to think through and rethink their sense of themselves and the sense of the other, and how the other and they related to each other, and so on and so forth. But you also made a comment about what diplomats are sent out to do, and I'm just reminded of the definition of diplomacy. If I take the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says the art and practice of conducting negotiations and managing relationships between nations or individuals to achieve their goals, both their goals, resolve conflicts, and maintain peaceful interactions. So diplomacy is not necessarily solely about trying to win. It's about trying to build more enduring relationships and safer relationships in the longer term. I don't know whether that deals with your question.
No, I think it answers, but where I'm going with that is that where is the role of educators in the process of diplomacy when there is a crisis? Because apparently we don't see that. We just assume that will happen on its own later on. But if the crisis is a crisis of, I'll give you another example. Hamas, Palestinian-Israeli crisis is also a crisis of narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, we can go there now and tell them stop fighting and all that stuff. But if the educational system continues to perpetuate those narratives, you're going to have more crisis in the future. So how do we factor in educators in the process of negotiation to make sure that it's not just a surface level ending, let's end the conflict, but rather let's also heal the psyche and heal the narratives that are playing out in these communities or societies. But again, it's just a thought I'm thinking through. So,
but I suppose what I was saying was that in parallel to whatever's happening between the in informal negotiations, there also needs to be work going on within the communities to build understanding and cooperation, and also respect for the process that the leaders are involved in, not only their own leaders, but the opponents that they're dealing with, that they're all willing to sit down and work together to try to solve the problems. So there is work that has to go on at community level, like the work I was just mentioning that the voluntary sector, our INGOs and other people were offering in Bosnia, where they were running little workshops and cooperative activities and so on and so forth. But what I was also saying, if I refer back to what I said to Janet, that what we would describe as the people in this meeting, I think, would describe as real negotiations and real mediation and real diplomacy is a longer term process where the parties really do sit down and understand each other and look each other in the eye and cooperate. I mean, to me, it's bizarre that you have a situation of these negotiations which are going on in Sharm el-Sheikh and the parties themselves are not talking directly to each other. How can they understand each other if they don't see each other and they only get messages sent to them by third parties, shuttle diplomacy? And how do they have any confidence in what the other side is promising or offering or committing to? So if you had real negotiations going on and you had and there you would need a ceasefire because you can't go on killing people at the rate that's being done while this process is going on. But if you can remind people that real negotiation means really sitting down and talking and thinking and learning and exploring the narratives together and questioning the narratives. I'm not talking about being nice to each other. I'm talking about being direct and as I say, expressing what you need to say and what you feel is important to say. And maybe you have to say it for quite a while before you change your narrative and begin to talk in somewhat different ways. So I'm seeing a double two-stage process which interacts with each other and should interact with each other.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for me being part. And good afternoon from Ghana. I want to ask this. How peaceful will it be to diplomacy? When a political appointee who just battled his or her way out through campaigning now become a diplomat, would there be, maybe after they're becoming diplomats, would there be some sort of training for them, or they just become diplomats and then start joining the others? Thank you.
You're from Ghana, you said? You said you're from Ghana?
Yes, please. I'm from Ghana, sir.
I'm imagining you're referring to somebody in particular. But I mean, if you look at, I can't speak to the case you're talking about, but if you look at what's happened in the United States, that the president's go-to person is Witchcough, who does deals with land and so on, you know, property deals. And he's been, because he's good at doing that, he's been brought in to deal with inter-community relations. I actually think he's learning. I think he has changed a bit over the time. He's begun to see the limitations of looking at it purely as a transactional trade deal. And I think he has begun to realize there's existential questions involved. And we haven't talked about that yet here, but it's in the kind of negotiation and the kind of diplomacy we're talking about, the existential dimension is very, very important. The people are not just doing it to get a quick fix, to get something material. They're talking about what their understanding of who they are is under threat. And therefore, that needs to be taken into account. So people who, I'm not saying diplomats who have started out at an early part of their career by becoming junior level diplomats and have worked their way up during the years and have done courses in diplomatic colleges and or done courses in international relations. I'm not sure saying that they're all perfect or they're all good at the job or they all really have a broad understanding of what it is they're trying to do. But they have a better chance than if someone is brought in from some other walk of life and thinks that they can be pretty good at it. I mean, quite by definition, ministers for foreign affairs are often not experts in diplomacy, and they will try to run their ministries in a way which they think is the good way to get things done. But hopefully their department heads and their public servants will help them to learn, and they'll learn fast. I certainly think that Diplomats Without Borders is one of its roles, I think, is to try to not educate individual diplomats who have suddenly arrived at the top of the tree, but to get the public awareness of this is what diplomacy is. And in a sense, what I'm saying is that if we're to do that, we also need the help of people like yourselves, for you also to be saying it to the world. This is what we need. This is how it needs to be done. This is why it works. This is why the other thing causes a lot of trouble, pain, and sorrow, and often doesn't work. So I can't say how this lady is going to get her training, but I hope she gets it fast.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So far, so good. We are trying to reclaim diplomacy. And there are so many questions that you asked, Clem, and, you know, like how to apply what we agree on. And probably that's moving from theory to practice. And the way I understand, like you're saying, let's train people, make them aware of the importance, relevance of diplomacy, and not just wait for people to be out there in offices trying to practice what actually they even don't understand or they don't even believe in. So yes, how do we apply what we agree on? And I don't know whether you've done some kind of, should I say, assessment, just looking at what we've been doing now for the Diplomats Without Borders, whether there has been some kind of, should I say, effect, you know, or some kind of change that you can say that you notice this over the time that you've been working on reclaiming diplomacy?
I think it's the other way around. I think we're seeing more resigning from the kind of ideas that we're referring to. And as I say, I'm very worried that if some of the things that are being done now through heavy-handed pressure and so on reach some kind of solution, even if it's not a long-term solution, and even if it's caused an awful lot of grief in the meantime, if that happens, is it going to encourage many other people to reject diplomacy and say we'll go for a different way of doing things? And I think it's quite likely that there are people watching what's going on and saying, I could do that. And I think what the people who are doing that need to be thinking about is there'll be a time when they need the international rules-based order. There's a time when they can't succeed in what they want to do by simply being able to impose their will on other people. And having destroyed the system, then what will be the consequences when they need it? You know, that even the strongest people today are not the strongest people tomorrow. And that we have, international level, we have systems of law and order because, you know, everybody needs it ultimately. And so in the international sphere, we need it as well. I think one of the things that we also need to, it's not quite the same. I'm not answering your question saying this, but let me go back to your question. So I don't think it's at this moment a question of assessing whether people are changing to be more positive about an inclusive approach to diplomacy. And also because many diplomats are scratching their head and feeling helpless in their own departments because their leadership is not following the kind of systems that you would imagine would be appropriate. You know, can you imagine if you're sitting in a country where you used to try to work cooperatively with other nations to solve problems, and you find that your leaders are destroying all that, all the goodwill and relationships that you've built up in the past? There's not much you can do about it as a serving diplomat, which is where former diplomats have a better role. But so I think we don't have a clear assessment yet, and we're only just beginning to work out how this is evolving. Going back actually to something Janet said about how, you know, 20 years ago perhaps, or some years ago, the system was working in a way. Well, it depends whether it was working or not. I mean, if you'd been at the wrong other end of, you know, and you made the point actually about what has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on and so forth. Just because people said they were doing things for the greater good and they were responsibility to protect, and they had various explanations for what they were doing. In those days, there was some pretty nasty things done, and many people have suffered from it. I mean, the whole of Africa has suffered from it, from the whole colonial period, when, you know, people had all kinds of claims of doing good for the people and solving the people's problems and bringing them civilization, but they didn't ask them if they wanted it or didn't want it in their terms. So we've a long history of using force to impose our will on other people. And we used to have this idea that we could explain that away because of our kindness or goodwill or moral obligation or whatever it might be. So in a way, what has changed is not the way that many people who have power work. It's been the fact that people don't bother to make an excuse for what they're doing anymore. They just do it. And this is where I have a problem, that I think I like the courtesies and I like the idea that people try to be respectful in the way they talk to each other. But I also am very aware that that can cover up some pretty unpleasant ways of working and pretty unpleasant ways of undermining other people whom you pretend that you're working with. So anyway, George, we have a lot to do, and I'm not sure that we see any signs of where we're getting to, but we need to be generating the methods and the actions, both within the diplomatic service and in the wider community, particularly among people like ourselves who work on these kind of issues, to get the kind of change that's needed. And I said, we're producing a little handbook, which is just simply a reminder, a prompt to people to think, is this what we really want to be happening? And giving them a little ideas of things they should say in conversation with other people that can challenge the overwhelming assumption that might is right.
Thank you so much, Clem, for that wonderful answer. Janet, you're welcome.
Thank you for responding to my comment. And I want to clarify what I was saying, that those of us who are working with the UN, working in global civil society, have always been trying to make things more honest, more fair, more visible. And I think in the United States, a lot of people believed we have a very great country. And starting around the time of the World Trade Center bombings, and then the government response to that, and then the continued government responses that made lies visible, that made torture okay and even obscenely humorous, that the public more and more lost faith in governance. And so, like, how would you help us think about our work with the public? I mean, I've always thought the UN was in a really significant place in terms of generating international law and generating international standards and bringing people together for those forums, those discussions, even when countries are pulling out their funding, etc., and weakening it. But how do we help people understand the importance of our and where we put our faith? That's my question. Thank you. Not that you have to answer that question. It's a query, right? But
it's on my list.
Maybe you'd like to take some more questions.
I think so, and I've got Janet's on my list.
All right. We go to Ben, and then Helen, and then Evelyn. Ben, please.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Clem. Sorry, I have cold and my voice is not good. Thank you for your presentation, Clem. I'm following what Janet said at the beginning of this question and answer. The diplomacy system, as you said yourself, seems to be broken. UN, the top leadership in diplomacy, and many other organizations supposed to help are also broken. I can give an example of diplomacy or mediation at the bottom level, the community level. In the Congo, DRC, this is my field of interest, by the way. In 2000, quarter of a century ago, I mediated in inter-community violent conflict. This was because Congo War, as you know, was played on several levels, at the national level and also in community level. The only problem I had with my team at that level of community mediation or inter-community mediation was sometimes we were accused by one party or in conflict or another to be corrupted mediators. Of course, when you don't say something the party doesn't like, when you say that, they will accuse you of being partial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know there are many or variant models of diplomacy, but in general, the principle may be the same. My question is this: what type of diplomacy are President Trump and his team using? That is my question.
Well, I'm arguing that they are good examples of the non-diplomacy that I'm talking about, the coercive pressure politics. And it would be better if you could find a word for diplomacy, a word that distinguishes diplomacy as we understand it and what they are doing. But at the moment, they've grabbed the word diplomacy and said that's what they're doing. And that's why we talk about reclaiming diplomacy, reclaiming the concept. But we don't have a way to distinguish that linguistically. And I think that's a big problem for me anyway, a big problem for us in trying to move forward. But isn't it amazing that it's a quarter of a century since 2000? Right, and I'd love to know more about what you were doing back then. But, you know, if you're using this kind of approach that we're talking about, of saying understanding and respecting all of the parties and demonstrating that in our own behavior and our own manner, it does put us at risk of being seen by people on one side or the other as we're being favoring or biased or closer to one side than the other. But maybe it's through that they begin to recognize that they have to be aware of and respect the other side as well. That they will come, hopefully, to see that when you're acknowledging that they have a point and you've got a point and so on and so forth, that they then begin to get to the point where they can say, yes, I see that the other side does have a point and we have to sit down and negotiate that together. So we are a bit exposed at a point where there's no trust between the parties, that they're looking for us not to be a person to be trusted as well. They fear that we're not to be trusted and we're taking control out of their hands, because we do actually at that point have quite a bit of control over the process. And so we do take that challenge, but we have to live with that. That's part of the task of our task, is to be able to demonstrate that we can respect both sides and they can respect each other, therefore, as also.
Thank you so much. Helen, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Normally, I try not to speak because I think that this should be a session for Africans to talk to other Africans and for people who are not African to listen and learn. But as possibly the only person on this discussion who has actually been a professional diplomat, I thought I should say something. I was actually a professional diplomat in Africa. I was the Australian High Commissioner to Zambia and Malawi, and also ambassador to Angola. So I have at least done this in an African context. And of course, I was representing Australia. And I would argue that one thing, there is a role for middle powers, because nobody thinks that Australia is going to go and invade somewhere in Africa. Or even, well, this isn't, I was about to say, or even have the major economic interests, but that isn't actually strictly true, because there are a lot of Australian mining companies who do have some involvement in Africa. But I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of my time doing in those days was negotiations on international treaties, on the law of the sea, on trying to do something about banning landmines, treaties of that kind that would support exactly the rules-based order that we think, we think we know it's a really valuable thing. But I must say that the one place in the world where I if somebody said, "What do you do?" when I was a diplomat, I didn't say, "Oh, I'm a diplomat." It was America. I think the American elite doesn't understand, and this is why Trump is so successful. He took the people who, the blue collar workers, the people who feel that the elite despise them, and he took them and he pretends to support them. Where if occasionally I said to the person in the street, a taxi driver, somebody selling me vegetables, whatever, in New York, that I was a diplomat, and they'd say, "Oh, where do you do that?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm doing something at the United Nations." They would then tell me that the United Nations, all these incredible rumors about what the United Nations did. But one of the ones that was really striking was that every time you used an ATM machine to get cash, the United Nations were taking a percentage. That's what ordinary people in America believed. And their lack of trust in the system, well, a lot of them just didn't care, what happens in Sudan, for example. But they wouldn't have known where Sudan was, and they didn't care. So how do we get back to getting a system in which the major powers see it as being in their own interest to support international treaties, to support the major international organizations, and particularly if we're talking about the African context, is there a decline in support for the African Union? Is that something that it's possible to do something about? To get back to Sudan, is there anything that people who are not in Sudan can do to support bringing peace to a country which is in such terrible, terrible straits at the moment? Thank you.
You're eligible for membership of Diplomats Without Borders.
Thank you.
Helen.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that noise in the background. Yeah. I mean, certainly if you asked your last point about Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt could do a lot. I mean, we're into proxy war territory where there are other countries which have a vested interest in supporting one side or another in a war, often because they have competition with another party which is supporting another interest. So, there are things that people can do, but we have let ourselves be hijacked by the helplessness of the system. And we also have to work out how we can actually get decent debate about these subjects going. The Security Council in the UN just can't work because they become a platform for posturing rather than a place for actually sharing and jointly trying to solve problems. The African Union, as I say, suffers with this a bit, but maybe not because there's not permanent vetoes. They may have a little bit more of a leverage, but they haven't felt able to have it requires a lot of skill and a lot of dexterity and a lot of fleet of foot if you are going to be able to tread into these issues and resolve them. And there's too many of them in a way. So I think it's difficult. And it's very easy to fall back on quick solutions, quick fixes of the kind which we are seeing too many of now. And so we don't put in the groundwork and the effort to try to make things be right in the long run, to use a proper mediation type process. I was interested, it was good you mentioned the landmines convention, because that was another example of how diplomats can work together to produce a solution. And now we're rolling back from that partly because of what happened in Ukraine, and other countries who one would have thought would have been very committed to that are now saying, well, we need to put landmines in to stop invasions of our country. So I think we need to recognize that there are some people who want to have a confrontational world. They feel more comfortable in a situation of confrontation. They don't like the idea of good relations, because good relations can begin to mean that you're losing out and someone else is getting an advantage over you. And so in many of these situations we're talking about, people have deliberately escalated. And when it begins to be possible that there's de-escalation happening, they do something else which puts the tension back up again. And that's something we have to call out when we see it happening. It doesn't happen by chance. You know, like, for example, when there was to be the conference on the two-state solution, Israel bombed Iran the same day or the day before. Well, they were probably going to do it anyway, but it's not, to me, it's no coincidence they did it in a day which disrupted something they didn't like in another area. They wanted to keep the level of tension up. And so when we are talking about working quietly, methodically, steadily, with respect, with cooperation, we also have to point out that other people are making it difficult for us to do that, because they fear it. They think it might give solutions which they don't personally like. And rather than sitting down and be part of reaching a solution which involves them, they crank up the tension again and make it all that much more difficult to resolve the situation. So I think, Helen, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of setbacks, but we have enough evidence around the world that it does work in the long run, and it works much better than any other way.
Well put. Thank you. Evelyn, please.
Thank you very much. And I also hesitated to ask a question because I was hoping to hear from others. But we are working on a project led by a Kenyan-Canadian on peace professionalism. And the intent behind the project is to identify the core values and the key competencies that would lead to effective peace building. And many of the values that you have mentioned for diplomacy are, in fact, values that have been raised for peace professionalism. And people react very differently to the concept of peace professionalism. Our intent is to raise the credibility of peace workers in a very disparate field at the moment, and by some form of networking coordination and blue skying, one might see a field of peace professionals with some peace professionals specializing in diplomacy. So my first question is just your reaction to the concept of peace professionalism. And the second question is, several years ago, as we were exploring the values and competencies for peace professionalism, we spoke with a very, very senior American trainer of diplomats. And he was all right with most of the values that we raised, which included empathy and humility and so on. But he said for diplomats, there could never be the concept of integrity. We spent almost an hour debating integrity. And so I would ask your reaction to that as well.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure what peace professionalism is. I think you're meaning core values, which are shared by a lot of people who work in the field of peace. And so I couldn't object to that at all, really. It's very important. And I don't know, I mean, I'd like to know much more about what you're doing, and maybe we can tell us more after this. Maybe you've done one of these sessions before now, I don't know. But yeah, I would be very interested to compare notes with you on what we're doing. Is it similar to what you're trying to do? Maybe if I was to be stereotypical, maybe I could say, is that not something about the nature of US society? That it was a US diplomat that found that difficult. Going back to the earlier comments from Helen, you know, the US is very isolationist. It's got a strong tendency of isolationism about them. They see themselves as separate from the rest of the world. In general, one of the biggest problems of any of the work that we're doing, I think, is exceptionalism. The idea that we're special, that my country's special, that my community's special. The war in Gaza is an awful lot to do with exceptionalism. And then you believe you're right and justified to do whatever you want because you've got a special dispensation to reinterpret the rules or to do things in your own way. And exceptionalism is also a very great source of threat. You know, you feel threatened by your specialness, that other people will undermine it and destroy it. And in a way, the US has got this very strong commitment to its constitution, to its statement of values, even when it doesn't apply them. But it believes in them very strongly, and it thinks it's applying them in everything it does, even when it invades another country. It thinks it's following them. And I find it quite interesting that the US has destroyed people's faith, other people's faith in the UN and in the US as a partner to work with. And we have this organization called Defenders of the United Nations Charter, which is challenging the way that which the United Nations Charter has been implemented, guided by the US as the dominant member. Of course, that means that the people who are the defenders of the UN Charter are countries like Russia, Cuba, North Korea. I can't remember all the other ones, Venezuela probably. I'm not sure what the African countries are, but there are a number of African countries. And you could easily dismiss it as saying these are all totalitarian states or whatever. But it shows that we need to have faith in the other countries that we're dealing with. And if a country is acting without integrity, it may think it's acting with integrity. As I say, it's acting within the rules, and it's acting honorably and is acting for the best motives. But the people who are on the receiving end of its actions will see it differently. And if they see this mismatch between the rhetoric and the action, they will be distrustful of that state and of the international order, which doesn't manage to manage that. And so we get this situation in which we don't believe we can work with each other because we don't see that each other is playing fair. Then integrity is fundamental. And you know, who is undermining the UN? It's the permanent members, all of the permanent members, as much as anybody else. And they're coming at it from very different directions and from very different cultures and societies. But they're all kind of trying to keep control and using, I would say, weasel words, if an expression from my country. You know, they're using in kind of interesting logic and philosophy in order to justify what they do. And that leaves everybody else wondering what's going on. So going right back to the question of the public losing faith, countries are losing faith because they see people acting in ways which are not with integrity. So if you're a diplomat, and if for whatever country you come from, if you act without integrity, you are creating problems for yourself down the line. And I think one of the elements, one of the areas that I often work in is the idea of encouraging people to think about what the unintended consequences of what you're doing is, and think forward into the future. And while you may say this gets me a solution which is workable in the short term, are you undermining other things which are extremely important to you and which you will need in the future? And so integrity is something that you have to act by. You don't have to tell everybody everything you're doing, but you have to be honest, which is what I think is integrity. You have to be true to who you are. And so I would have had another hour's discussion with your diplomat. He may be a member of my organization for all I know.
He was actually teaching diplomacy. Basically teaching diplomats diplomacy.
But I think US diplomats and US people in general are very worried about being taken advantage of by other people, having their, like what Helen was talking about. And it means that they in turn end up being very defensive and aggressively defensive.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Another non-African claiming a small experience of a year at age 17 in Nigeria. I see a contextual change in the last 20 years or so, which has empowered the tech platforms to manipulate attention. And it has given them extraordinary power to disrupt, and then soon enough to really herd people in whatever directions they wish. Divide and conquer is tremendously refined now. There is rampant screen addiction. And I think that it's even possible with AI now to manipulate individuals according to what characteristics are discerned in their database dossier to induce them to commit crimes. And it's very disturbing to me that the major big data AI-driven platforms such as Oracle are basically radical Zionists. So diplomacy is floating on these waters now. Wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I'm sure you're right. I mean, the social media platforms have made our life all much more controlled and much more difficult. And it's very difficult to deal with that, but we have to keep trying, and we have to use the systems that we have available, our own way of understanding and speaking out. And we also have to speak out in these platforms, even though we don't have the same capacity to generate attention as would be by many other people and many other institutions and agencies. And I'm not someone who has really delved into that or have any particular wish to delve into it, but I hope people are and thinking about it. But I would say also that it's not a new phenomenon. It's been amplified and expanded by the social media, but people have always been controlled and influenced and corralled by clever public relations, even before the word public relations was invented. That we do have social narratives, is going back to what was said earlier about who we think we are and what we think is important. And now that can be further managed and manipulated. But I think we also have to recognize that social media can influence us by tapping into things which are part of us anyway. They touch on to certain assumptions, certain beliefs, certain social factors in our way of being, which are ready to be touched. You know, if people don't feel they have agency in their country, if they don't feel they have voice in their country, then there's consequences from that. And those consequences have come out through all kinds of ways down through the centuries. Now, social media can give vent to that, can give opportunity to that, can reinforce that feeling of lack of voice or less lack of agency in their environment, in their situation, and give them an impetus to try to do something about it, which may well be something which is not very nice. It's at the expense of other people. But most people also have the other side of them, in the side of the altruistic, the caring, the responsible, the empathetic. Those are all elements within us. And those are there to be tapped into and reinforced and encouraged. And it's hard for us to do it to the degree to which big tech can do it. But we can do it, and we do it. And it is happening. People here have been talking about the work they've been doing and peace building and so on and so forth. So I think you touch on a very big challenge to us, but that doesn't mean we don't have to keep going and keep using the opportunities we have. I always liked an expression. I pin my hopes in small circles I pin my hopes in small circles and quiet places where vital and transforming events take place. To me, that's very important, that we work and expand from the small circles to the wider circles to the wider circles. We don't necessarily come in from the top down and try to manipulate people. We try to work upwards. We help people to sort of take responsibility for positive action and for spreading that positive action to other people. And social media isn't the platform for doing that, but it's a platform I would prefer to use.
I agree with you. And it's my belief that it is in the realm of relationship that the social media are doing the most harm.
Yeah.
Because the machine is unaware of relationship. It has no access whatsoever to relationship.
Yeah.
So artificial intelligence is really artificial imbecility. It can never access the truth because the truth isn't in words.
Yeah.
So it is a terrible challenge, and I think there's been a very big shift in the balance of power generally, under which we are reeling from the impact right now. And I think that your work is addressing it specifically at the best points, because it is in relationship where it has no sway. All it can do is detract us from relationship and have us arguing over trivialities. So thank you very much.
When I first spoke, I said, when I was beginning to speak, I was saying that what I wanted to talk about is how people change and how communities change. And I haven't kept referring back to that, but that is really what I've been talking about, and it is in communities that they do change individually, but they change much more or stay the same much more within the context of the community they're part of. And sometimes that's negative. Often it's negative. It keeps them locked in a not very desirable relationship situation, espousing not very nice views. I did a PhD once. I gave it the nice title, Politics of Intransigence, how our local communities keep us intransigent.
Well, your sound just
went before the time of social media.
You're good.
My sound went off?
It did for a second.
Oh, sorry. You probably didn't miss much.
Well, community is where life actually lives.
Yeah.
And whether it's good or evil, it's alive.
Mm-hmm.
This other thing, we are really challenged by. I will be quiet now. Thank you.
But we do need relationship. We do need community. AI is blinding us to the fact that we do, or thinking that we're getting it somewhere else. But ultimately, we will not get it there. And we will need to fall back to real relationships again. And of course, many of us do still rely on real relationships.
Thank you very much indeed, Clem. We are slowly coming to the end of this wonderful discussion. And I don't know whether you wanted to say something about Janet's question. Probably responded to it already. And I'm so...
Well, I hope she has noticed that her points have come in at various points. The one quote that I had in my little list was the iron fist in the velvet glove. The idea that things used to be done within a velvet glove, but you didn't notice the iron fist inside. Now the glove is off and you see the iron fist. Is that better? That's a question to leave you with.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. In fact, today I heard several people saying, I came here to listen. And in fact, they are excellent listeners for sure. But when I look at them, actually more than half have already spoken to us. They can also speak. I'm so grateful that you are always with us. I thank you for always taking part in our discussions. I look forward to seeing you all next week, next Wednesday. And so I thank you so much, Clem, McCartney, for this great experience that you've shared with us. And I believe that you have also more diplomats also joining you and joining us. Maybe you've got a last word for us, Clem?
Sorry? No, I thought that was my last word, and this was your last word. But I know that Evelyn has sent me her email, and I haven't had time to copy it down. So maybe I'll contact with you some other way. I forgot to look at the chat box as we were talking. Okay, so no, I'm very glad to have had this chance to talk to you and flesh out my own ideas a bit and have a bit of come and go with you. I'd like to have heard you having more come and go with each other, but that's for another day.
And I'd just like to bring up this handbook and the, having access to, because some of us have ways to distribute what you're distilling.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I was mentioning it a little while ago. And when we get it approved by our board, I'll send a copy to George.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye for now. Thank you so much, Peter, for the recording. And I wish you all the best.